Anita, a disgraced former maid, remains unnervingly still as a $5,000 bottle of vintage Cabernet stains the floor at her feet. Instead of trembling under the verbal assault of a socialite, she keeps her gaze fixed on the one person who shouldn't know she exists. She makes a silent movement, a subtle, protective tuck of her son's shoulder that mirrors a defensive stance known only to the Ju-Mong inner circle. This gesture is caught only by Ju-Mong, the most ruthless patriarch in the Underworld. This single moment of recognition halts a gala, threatens a criminal dynasty, and unearths a 7-year-old secret that could bankrupt an empire. The setting is the grand ballroom of the St. Regis, a sea of silk and hypocrisy, at 9:14 p.m. during the height of the Lunar Gala. A woman who has spent 7 years mastering the art of being invisible, clad in a simple cream uniform that screams servant. Her only jewelry is the stoic set of her jaw and the hidden truth she carries in her mind. The undisputed king of the city's shadows, he stands at the center of the room in a pristine white 3-piece suit, his neck tattoos peeking out like a warning. Beside him is Juliana, a woman draped in blood-red silk who treats the world like her footstool. As Anita attempted to pivot away from the elite crowd, Juliana's deliberate stumble caused a glass to shatter, wine spraying across the red dress. As Juliana began a high-pitched tirade demanding Anita's worthless head, Ju-Mong stepped forward to end the scene. But he stopped dead. His eyes aren't on the wine or the woman, they are locked on Henry, the 7-year-old boy standing guard in front of Anita. The boy doesn't flinch. He stares back with dragon eyes, the exact, lethal, unblinking gaze Ju-Mong sees in the mirror every morning, and Ju-Mong realizes the maid didn't just leave his house 7 years ago, she stole his legacy. The air in the St. Regis ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive cologne, a suffocating perfume that Anita had learned to breathe through. She kept her head low, her movements practiced and fluid. In her simple cream dress, she was a ghost in a garden of peacocks. Beside her, Henry gripped the hem of her apron, his small hand a steady anchor. She had told him to stay close, to be a shadow, and he had obeyed with a solemnity that often broke her heart. 20 feet away, Ju-Mong stood like a monument of carved ice. The white 3-piece suit he wore was a statement of absolute purity and absolute power, a stark contrast to the dark ink that climbed his throat like ivy. He didn't look like the man she had served years ago. He looked like a god who had forgotten the meaning of mercy. Beside him, Juliana was aflame in blood-red silk, her laughter sharp enough to draw blood. Anita tried to pivot, to slip back toward the kitchen doors before the orbit of their power pulled her in, but the universe had other plans. Juliana turned too quickly, a flute of vintage Cabernet in her hand. Whether it was an accident or a predator's whim, the result was the same. The glass clipped Anita's shoulder, shattering against the polished marble. A spray of deep arterial red erupted across the hem of Juliana's dress and the pristine cream of Anita's uniform. The music didn't stop, but the conversation did. The silence was instantaneous and predatory. "You clumsy, pathetic creature!" Juliana's voice sliced through the ballroom. She looked down at the dark stain on her hip as if it were a physical wound. "Do you have any idea what this costs? More than you'll make in 3 lifetimes!" Anita dropped to her knees, not out of fear, but out of the muscle memory of a woman who had spent years cleaning up other people's messes. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll get a cloth." "You'll get on your knees and beg," Juliana hissed, stepping closer, the heel of her shoe inches from Anita's hand. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you." Anita raised her head. She didn't look at Juliana. Her eyes instinctively sought the one person who could truly destroy her. Ju-Mong was watching, his expression unreadable, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. He looked bored until Anita's hand instinctively moved toward Henry. She didn't just grab him, she shifted her weight, tucking her thumb into her palm and stepping slightly in front of the boy, the vanguard's shield, a defensive stance the Ju-Mong guards used when protecting the bloodline. It was a reflex, a ghost of a life she thought she'd buried. Ju-Mong's posture changed, the boredom vanished, replaced by a terrifying, predatory focus. He didn't look at the spilled wine, he didn't look at his fuming fiancée, he looked at Anita's hands, then tracked upward to the boy. Henry didn't hide behind her mother's skirts. He stood tall in his blue polo, his small chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. He looked directly at the Mafia boss. There was no fear in the child's eyes, only a cold, analytical stoicism, the dragon eyes, the exact, lethal, unblinking gaze Ju-Mong sees in the mirror every morning. And Ju-Mong realized the maid didn't just leave his house 7 years ago, she stole his legacy.
"Stand up," he said. His voice was a low, resonant hum that vibrated in Anita's marrow. Anita stood, keeping Henry tucked against her side. She refused to tremble. She had the encryption keys to his entire world locked in a brain he thought was empty. That knowledge was her spine. Ju-Mong ignored the mother and knelt. It was a gesture of such unexpected humility that a collective gasp rippled through the room. He leveled his gaze with Henry's. "What is your name, boy?" Ju-Mong asked. Henry didn't blink. He matched the man's lethal, unblinking stare with a terrifying precision. "Henry," the boy replied, his voice steady. "And you're blocking the way. My mother needs to clean the glass before someone gets hurt." A ghost of a smile, sharp and dangerous, flickered on Ju-Mong's lips. He reached out, his tattooed hand hovering near the boy's face. Juliana stepped forward, her face contorted. "Ju-Mong, what are you doing? She's just a servant." "She was never just a servant," Ju-Mong whispered, finally looking up at Anita. His eyes were no longer bored, they were burning with a dark, possessive fire. He stood up, his height looming over them both. He looked at the red stain on Anita's dress, then at the red stain on Juliana's. "The wine is a waste," Ju-Mong said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. He turned to his lead security detail, who had appeared like shadows behind him. "Cancel the engagement announcement, clear the room, and bring the woman and the boy to my study." "Ju-Mong!" Juliana shrieked, her face turning a shade of red that matched her dress. "You can't be serious!" Ju-Mong didn't look back at her. He looked at the scorched earth he had left behind 7 years ago, and for the first time he saw what had grown in the ashes. "I have never been more serious in my life," he said. The silence of the mahogany-lined study was a physical weight, far heavier than the orchestrated chaos of the ballroom below. Ju-Mong sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of obsidian, his white suit jacket discarded, shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the full, intricate tapestry of black ink snaking down his forearms. Anita stood in the center of the room, her hand resting on Henry's shoulder. She felt the heat of the boy through the thin fabric of his polo, a reminder of the life she had breathed into existence while the man before them had been busy ending others. On the desk sat a sterile medical kit, a silver tray, a vacuum tube, and a single gleaming needle. "You've grown quiet, Anita," Ju-Mong said, his voice a low, velvet rasp. He didn't look at her, his eyes were fixed on the boy. 7 years of silence. I expected a scream or a plea for mercy, not this. "I learned long ago that mercy isn't a currency you trade in, Ju-Mong," Anita replied, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. "We were fine in the shadows, we didn't ask to be found." "The shadows are no place for a prince," Ju-Mong countered, finally meeting her gaze. The intensity in his eyes was predatory, searching for the crack in her armor, the secret she was protecting with the ferocity of a cornered lion. He gestured to the doctor waiting by the door. "We will settle the matter of his lineage now. Science will confirm what my eyes already know." The doctor stepped forward, his movements clinical and quick. Anita felt a surge of panic, a desperate urge to snatch Henry and run, but she knew the doors were guarded by men who valued their lives more than her son's freedom. "Henry," she whispered, kneeling so she was eye level with the boy. "He needs a drop of your blood, just a little bit, like a hero's badge." Henry looked at the needle, then at the man sitting behind the desk. He didn't look at the doctor. The boy climbed into the oversized leather chair opposite his father, his legs dangling, looking small yet strangely monumental. He extended his arm without being asked, his small fist clenched once, then relaxed, palm up. The doctor applied the tourniquet. The vein surfaced, a delicate blue thread of Ju-Mong's own history. When the needle pierced the skin, Anita flinched, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. Henry didn't flinch. He didn't whimper. He didn't even blink. He watched the dark crimson fluid spiral into the glass tube with a detached analytical curiosity. His face remained a mask of marble, his breathing rhythmic and deep. It was a terrifying display of self-control in a child so young, a trait that wasn't taught but inherited. Ju-Mong leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the obsidian desk so hard his knuckles turned as white as the white suit jacket. He wasn't watching the blood, he was watching the boy's eyes. He was looking for a tear, a tremor of the lip, any sign of the maid's softness. He found none. He found only the cold, lethal stoicism of a king. The doctor withdrew the needle and pressed a cotton ball to the site. "Done," he murmured, glancing nervously at the boss. Ju-Mong waved him away without a word. The door clicked shut, leaving the three of them in a silence that tasted of copper and old regrets.
"He didn't cry," Ju-Mong said, his voice barely a whisper. "He doesn't have time for tears," Anita said, her voice hardening. "He's had to be the man of a house that had no man." Ju-Mong stood, moving around the desk with the grace of a panther. He stopped in front of Henry, looking down at the boy who carried his face, his eyes, and his iron blood. He reached out, his thumb grazing the boy's jawline, a touch that was surprisingly light, almost reverent. "The test is a formality now," Ju-Mong said, his gaze shifting to Anita. "The blood has already spoken. He is mine." "He is himself," Anita snapped, stepping between them, breaking the contact. "He is not a piece of your empire to be claimed. He is not one of your assets." Ju-Mong stepped into her personal space, the scent of sandalwood and danger enveloping her. He tilted her chin up, his eyes searching hers with a dark, newfound hunger. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "I know you didn't just take a child when you left, Anita. I know what's missing from my father's records, and now that I have the boy, I have all the time in the world to find out where you've hidden the keys to my kingdom." Anita's blood went cold, but she didn't pull away. She had played the maid for years. It was time to play the gatekeeper. "The keys aren't in a vault, Ju-Mong," she whispered back. "They're in my head, and if you want them, you'll have to make sure my son never sheds a tear in this house." Ju-Mong stepped back, a dangerous, genuine smile spreading across his face. Challenge accepted. The transition from the grimy reality of the city to the suffocating opulence of the Ju-Mong estate happened in a blur of tinted glass and silent engines. By midnight, Anita found herself standing in the center of the East Wing, a sprawling sanctuary of silk-paneled walls and vaulted ceilings that had once been a forbidden territory to a girl with a mop and a bucket.
The air here didn't smell of cleaning supplies or cheap grease. It smelled of beeswax and cold history. "Your belongings will be sent for," Mr. Henderson said, his voice once a whip that had cracked over Anita's head for the slightest streak on a windowpane, now was a low, melodic murmur of submission. He didn't look her in the eye. Instead, he kept his gaze precisely 3 inches below her chin, his spine bent in a permanent shallow bow. "I don't have belongings, Henderson," Anita said, her voice echoing off the marble. "I have a son, and he needs to sleep." She felt the shift in the atmosphere immediately. The staff, a small army of maids and footmen, stood lined against the corridor walls like porcelain dolls. These were the same people who whispered "charity case" behind her back 7 years ago, the ones who purposefully tripped her in the servants' hall when her pregnancy began to show. Now, as she walked past them with Henry's hand in hers, they didn't whisper. They recoiled. They bowed so low their shadows folded against the floor. It was a golden cage, polished to a high shine, designed to remind her that while she was no longer a servant, she was still a prisoner of Ju-Mong's gravity. She led Henry into the primary suite, where a bed the size of a small island waited. The linens were Egyptian cotton, crisp and cool, a far cry from the lumpy mattress in their studio apartment. Henry climbed onto the edge of the bed, his small boots looking out of place against the ivory duvet. He looked around the room with a wary, predatory focus, his dragon eyes cataloging every exit, every heavy curtain, every shadow. "Mom," he whispered, his voice small for the first time that night, "is this where the king lives?" "No, Henry, this is just where he keeps the things he thinks he owns. But you own yourself. Remember that." A soft click at the door made them both tense. Ju-Mong stood in the threshold. He had changed into a black silk robe, the ink on his chest peeking through the collar like a dark secret. He didn't enter the room. He simply leaned against the doorframe, watching the tableau of mother and son. "The East Wing has the best security," Ju-Mong said, "and the best view of the gardens. I thought the boy should see the world he will one day oversee." "He'd prefer a park with a swing set," Anita countered, her eyes hardening, "not a fortress built on blood." Ju-Mong stepped into the room, his movements silent. He walked to a side table where a heavy silver tray had been placed. On it sat a glass of milk for the boy and a crystal decanter of amber liquor for her. He ignored the alcohol and picked up the milk, bringing it over to Henry. The boy took the glass, his small fingers brushing against Ju-Mong's tattooed knuckles. Neither of them flinched.
"Tomorrow," Ju-Mong said, looking down at his son, "you will have your swing set. You will have whatever you desire. But in return, you will begin your lessons. A Ju-Mong must know how to lead before he knows how to play." "He's 7, Anita snapped, standing up to bridge the gap between them. "He isn't a weapon you can just start sharpening." Ju-Mong turned his gaze to her, his eyes dark and unreadable. He reached out, his hand hovering near her waist before he let it drop. "He was born a weapon, Anita. You're the one who tried to pretend he was a shield. The world is already coming for him. Juliana is just the first wave. If you want him to survive the hidden truth you're carrying, you'll let me forge him into something that cannot be broken." He walked toward the door, stopping only to look back over his shoulder. The light from the hallway framed him in silhouette, a dark king in a house of gold. "Sleep well," he said. "The staff has been instructed. Your word in this wing is law, but do not mistake the silk for safety. The cage is still locked." As the door closed, Anita looked at the bowed heads of the servants visible in the hall. They weren't bowing to her, she realized. They were bowing to the storm she had brought into the house. The morning sun in the East Wing did not feel like a new beginning. It felt like a spotlight in an interrogation room.
Anita stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the mist roll off the manicured hedges of the estate. The quiet was broken not by the sounds of the household waking, but by the sharp, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of stiletto heels against the marble corridor. The door to the suite didn't open, it was invaded. Juliana stepped into the room, her presence a jarring streak of neon against the muted creams and golds of the sanctuary. She wasn't wearing the blood red of the night before, but a sharp, clinical white suit that seemed like a frantic attempt to reclaim the purity Ju-Mong had projected. Her eyes, however, were anything but pure. They were rimmed with the frantic, jagged edge of a woman who had seen her throne turn into a mirage. "It's a lovely room, isn't it?" Juliana said, her voice a forced, brittle silk. She didn't wait for an invitation. She swept past Anita, trailing the scent of a floral perfume so heavy it felt like a warning. "I picked the wallpaper myself 3 months ago. I thought it would be perfect for a nursery for my children." Anita turned slowly, keeping her back to the window. Henry was in the adjoining dressing room, being fitted for a wardrobe that cost more than their previous life. "The room is fine, Juliana, but we aren't here for the decor." "Oh, I know why you're here." Juliana stopped at a vanity table, picking up a crystal perfume bottle and turning it over in her manicured hands. "You're a strategic investment, a biological curiosity. Ju-Mong has always had a weakness for broken things he can fix or lost things he can find. But let's be very clear, Anita." She set the bottle down with a sharp thud. "You are a ghost, and ghosts don't get to sit at the dinner table." Juliana walked toward Anita, her gaze dropping to the cream fabric of Anita's dress, the same one she had stained the night before, now meticulously cleaned by the staff. "Do you think a few drops of blood and a well-timed entrance make you a queen? You were the girl who scrubbed the toilets. You were the girl who ran away because you were too weak to handle the weight of his name." "I ran to save his life," Anita said, her voice dropping to a dangerous low hum. "Something you wouldn't understand. You only value what he can give you. I value what he is." Juliana laughed, a short, jagged sound. "What he is a monster, darling, and monsters get bored of their toys. Right now, you're the novelty, but tomorrow, you're the liability." She stepped into Anita's personal space, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I've already spoken to the council. They're asking questions about your disappearance, about the gaps in the digital ledgers from the year you left. They don't see a mother, they see a thief. And Ju-Mong, he might want the boy, but he hates a traitor more than he loves his own blood." Anita felt the cold press of the encryption keys against her subconscious, the invisible weight that Juliana was poking at without even knowing it. "Is that your plan?" Anita asked. Her expression remains a mask of stone. "Is that your plan, to whisper in the ears of old men?" "My plan is to remind you of your place," Juliana hissed. She reached out, flicking a stray hair off Anita's shoulder with a sneer. "The staff bows to you today because he told them to, but they still talk. They remember the girl who cried in the pantry. They know you don't belong in this wing, and soon Ju-Mong will remember it too. A man like him doesn't marry the help. He uses her until the truth comes out, and then he discards the evidence." She turned toward the door, pausing just long enough to look at Henry, who had stepped into the doorway of the dressing room. The boy stood perfectly still, watching the exchange with those unnerving, ancient eyes.
"Enjoy the silk while it lasts, little prince," Juliana said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Even the prettiest cages eventually get cleaned out." As Juliana swept out of the room, the silence she left behind was corrosive. Anita felt the psychological barbs sinking in, the reminder of her status, the threat of the council, the looming shadow of the thief label.
Juliana wasn't just fighting for a man, she was marking the territory for an execution. Henry walked over to Anita, slipping his hand into hers. "She's afraid, Mom." Anita looked down at her son, surprised by the clarity in his voice. "How do you know?" "Because she talks too much," Henry said, his gaze fixed on the door where the red-soled shoes had disappeared. "The king only speaks when he's going to do something. She's just making noise to hide the shaking." Anita squeezed his hand, a chilling realization settling over her. The psychological warfare had begun, but Juliana had made a fatal mistake. She was treating the mother like a victim and the son like a child. She had no idea she was trapped in a room with two people who had already survived the worst. The sun set behind the estate, casting long, skeletal shadows across Ju-Mong's private study. He sat in the darkness, the only light coming from the glowing amber of the whiskey in his glass and the moonlight catching the silver of his rings. When Anita entered, she didn't knock. She moved with the quiet confidence of a woman who was done hiding in the corners of his world. "Juliana was in my room today," her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "She thinks I'm a thief. She thinks I'm a liability that the council will eventually scrub away." Ju-Mong didn't look up. "Juliana thinks in terms of social standing and jewelry. She is a distraction, but she isn't wrong about one thing. The council is restless. They want to know why a maid from 7 years ago is suddenly occupying the East Wing with a child who looks like a ghost of the great patriarch." He finally raised his eyes, and the intensity in them made the air feel thin. "Why did you really run, Anita? I was the heir. I could have protected you. Instead, you vanished into the night, leaving me with a hole in my life and a ledger that had been bled dry of its most vital access codes." Anita walked toward the desk, her reflection ghosting across the polished obsidian. "You think you could have protected me. You were a prince in a house of wolves, Ju-Mong. You didn't even know your own father had a silencer pressed to my terminal the night I left." The glass in Ju-Mong's hand paused halfway to his lips. "My father?" "He didn't just want me gone because I was pregnant with bastard blood," Anita whispered, leaning over the desk until she was inches from his face. "He wanted me gone because I had the back door to the offshore empire. I was the one who managed his digital encryption, remember? I wasn't just scrubbing floors, I was scrubbing his trails. And the moment he realized I knew how much he was skimming from the council, he ordered my execution." Ju-Mong's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his tattooed neck. The betrayal of a dead man hung between them, cold and stagnant. "He told me you took the money and ran because you didn't want the burden of the family." "He lied. He sent a man to the servants' quarters to finish it. I didn't run for money, Ju-Mong. I bartered." She reached out, her fingers hovering over the medical kit still sitting on the side table, the remnant of the DNA test. "I told him that if I died, a dead man's switch would trigger. The encryption keys to every hidden account, every bribe to the Senate, and every black market transit route would be broadcast to the federal authorities and the rival families in the South." She let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 7 years. "I traded my disappearance for your family's survival. I became a ghost so your father wouldn't have to become a prisoner. And I kept those keys, those hidden truths, as my insurance. If anything happened to Henry, or if your family ever tried to hunt us down, I'd burn this entire kingdom to the ground from a laptop in a basement." Ju-Mong stood up slowly, his presence looming, a dark tower of sudden, violent realization. He walked around the desk, his movements predatory, yet restrained. He didn't look at her with anger. He looked at her with a terrifying, newfound reverence. "You didn't just steal the keys," he murmured, his hand coming up to cup the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the racing pulse beneath her skin. "The heartbeat of the Ju-Mong Empire you held in your hands for 7 years, and you never used it. You lived in poverty while holding the codes to billions." "I wanted peace, not a throne," Anita said, her voice trembling for the first time. "But Juliana is right about one thing. I am a liability now, because as long as I'm in this house, the council will realize that the keys are back in the building, and they won't stop until they have them." Ju-Mong pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. The scent of sandalwood and old blood debts enveloped her. "Let them try. My father was a fool to think he could kill the woman who held his life in her head. And the council is a fool if they think I will let them touch the mother of my son."
He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his expression hardening into something lethal. "You kept the Empire alive for 7 years, Anita. Now let me show you what it looks like when that Empire fights for you." The estate's private playground was a masterpiece of architectural irony, a sprawling complex of cedar and steel nestled within a fortress of stone. To any other child, it was a wonderland. To Anita, it was a kill zone. She stood on the perimeter, her eyes scanning the tree line while Henry sat on a swing, his movements methodical and quiet. He didn't play so much as he occupied the space, a small soldier in a blue polo awaiting the next command. Ju-Mong was in the city, dealing with the council's restlessness, leaving the East Wing under the watchful eyes of cameras and a hand-picked detail. But Anita knew cameras were only as loyal as the hands that operated the feed. The air shifted, the afternoon stillness punctured by a sound that didn't belong, the low metallic whine of a faulty gate hinge. From the shadow of the gardener's shed, 2 men emerged. They weren't dressed in the Ju-Mong livery. They wore the nondescript gray of hired contractors, ghosts meant to perform a workplace accident. Above them, on the second-story balcony of the main house, Anita caught a flash of blood-red silk. Juliana was watching, her silhouette a frozen statue of anticipation. "Henry, stay on the swing," Anita said, her voice dropping into a register of cold command that stopped the boy mid-arc. The men didn't run, they walked with the arrogant leisure of those who thought they were hunting a maid. One carried a heavy coil of industrial wire, the other had his hand tucked into a jacket pocket that sagged with the weight of steel. "The lady says the equipment is unsafe, ma'am," the lead man said, his voice a gravelly sneer. "We're here to decommission the area. Best you take the brat and go." "The boy has a name," Anita replied. She didn't retreat, she stepped forward, her hands sliding into the hidden pockets of her cream dress. "And you have 10 seconds to realize that Ju-Mong's fiancée doesn't pay well enough for the funeral your families will have to host." The men laughed, but the sound died quickly as Anita's posture shifted. The Vanguard shield stance wasn't just for show. It was the foundation of a combat style she had perfected in the dark corners of the city while the world thought she was a victim. The first man lunged, reaching for her throat. Anita didn't scream. She pivoted, the movement a blur of efficiency. She caught his wrist, using his own momentum to drive his palm into his chin. The crack of bone echoed against the cedar playset. Before he could hit the ground, she drove a heel into his kneecap and stripped the wire from his hand. The other man pulled the suppressed pistol from his jacket, but he was too slow. Anita wasn't a maid anymore. She was the woman who had held the digital keys to a billion-dollar slaughterhouse. She knew exactly where the pressure points were, in an empire and in a man. She swung the heavy coil of wire like a flail, the metal catching the gunman across the temple. He staggered, the gun firing a muffled thud into the wood chips. Anita was on him in an instant. She didn't use her fists, she used her environment. She slammed his head against the steel support of the swing set, then pinned him to the ground with a knee to his throat. "Tell her," Anita hissed, her face inches from the man's terrified eyes.
Tell the woman in the red dress that if she ever looks at my son again, I won't just kill her, I will delete her existence. I'll wipe her bank accounts, her family's records, and her very name from the digital history of this world before her heart hits its next beat. You understand?" The man choked out a panicked nod. Anita stood up, her breathing barely elevated. She smoothed her dress and turned to look at the balcony. Juliana was gone, the red silk replaced by an empty doorway. "Mom?" Henry called out. He hadn't moved from the swing. His eyes were wide, but not with fear. He was looking at her with a profound, chilling recognition. He had seen the dragon in her. "It's okay, Henry," Anita said, her voice returning to its soft maternal lilt. "The equipment was just unstable." A shadow fell across the wood chips. Ju-Mong stood at the edge of the playground, his suit jacket slung over one arm, his expression one of stunned, dark fascination. He had arrived just in time to see the Maid dismantle two professional hitters with the cold precision of a high-ranking enforcer. He looked at the unconscious men, then at the wire in Anita's hand, and finally at the fierce, protective fire in her eyes. He had expected to have to save her. He hadn't expected to realize that she was the most dangerous weapon in his arsenal. "I see," Ju-Mong said, his voice thick with a new kind of hunger. "You didn't just learn the encryption keys, Anita. You learned the violence that guard them." "I learned what was necessary," Anita replied, walking past him toward the house. "Next time, tell your fiancée to send more men, or better yet, tell her to come herself."
The air in the council chamber was thick with the smell of old paper and stale tobacco, a sanctuary of ancient men who ruled the city from high-backed velvet chairs. Ju-Mong stood at the center of the room, the moonlight through the stained-glass windows turning his white suit into a shroud of silver. Behind him, the heavy oak doors remained closed, keeping Anita and Henry in the hallway, the maid and the bastard waiting on the threshold of a world that viewed them as viruses. "Tradition is the bone of this family, Ju-Mong," Elder Vance rasped, his withered hand tapping a rhythmic beat on the mahogany table. "You were betrothed to the House of Silva to settle a debt of blood and territory. To break that engagement for a servant and a child of unverified standing is not just a scandal, it is a declaration of instability." "The standing is verified," Ju-Mong replied, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "The boy is my image, he is my blood." "Blood is common," another elder countered, his eyes narrow and reptilian. "Alliances are rare. Juliana Silva brings the support of the southern ports. The girl brings nothing but the scent of the pantry and a history of theft. She disappeared with the family's ledgers, Ju-Mong. She is a thief who has returned to the scene of the crime using a child as a shield." Ju-Mong's hands tightened at his sides. He thought of Anita on the playground, the way she had dismantled the hitters with a cold, lethal efficiency that surpassed most of the men in this room. He thought of the hidden truth, the encryption keys that could vaporize the wealth of every man sitting at this table. They were calling her a thief, unaware that she was the only reason they weren't already in handcuffs or coffins. The doors creaked open. Juliana stepped into the chamber, her red dress a vivid wound against the somber room. She didn't look like the panicked woman who had fled the balcony. She looked like a martyr. She walked to Ju-Mong's side, her eyes brimming with calculated tears. "I am willing to forgive the lapse in judgment, Ju-Mong," she whispered, loud enough for the council to hear. "I will even accept the boy. We can send the woman away with a pension, and I will raise him as my own, for the sake of the family, for the sake of our union." "A generous offer," Vance nodded. "The boy stays to be trained. The woman leaves by dawn. This is the choice, Ju-Mong. Marry the Silva girl and secure the empire, or follow the impulse of your loins and watch the council strip you of your title. A king does not rule alone." Ju-Mong looked at Juliana. He saw the greed beneath the tears, the venom that had tried to poison his son only hours before. Then he looked toward the doors where Anita stood visible through the gap.
She wasn't weeping, she wasn't pleading. She stood with her chin high, her eyes fixed on him with a challenge that was both a warning and a promise. She had the power to destroy them all, yet she was waiting to see if he was man enough to deserve her silence. "You speak of tradition as if it is a cage," Ju-Mong said, turning back to the elders. He reached up, slowly loosening his silver tie. "You think my power comes from the silver ports, or the council's blessing. You've forgotten how this family began. It didn't begin with a contract. It began with a man who was strong enough to take what was his and kill anyone who stood in his way." He stepped toward Elder Vance, leaning over the table until the tattoos on his neck were inches from the old man's face. "You want me to choose between the Empire and my bloodline?" Ju-Mong's voice was a lethal whisper. "You've made a mistake in the math. You think the girl is the liability. You don't realize that she is the fortress. If I send her away, she takes the keys to every vault you own. She doesn't just leave, she erases us." A ripple of unease moved through the elders. Juliana's face paled, her hand dropping from Ju-Mong's arm as if he had turned into a live wire. "I am not choosing a maid over a fiancée," Ju-Mong declared, his voice booming in the vaulted chamber. "I am choosing a partner over a parasite. The engagement is ended. The House of Ju-Mong does not bargain with its legacy." "This is war, then," Vance breathed, his face contorting. "The Silvas will not take this insult lightly." "Then let there be war," Ju-Mong said, turning his back on the council. He walked toward the door, his eyes locked on Anita. "He spent 7 years ruling a kingdom of paper. It's time I ruled one of blood." As he reached Anita, he didn't pass her. He took her hand, pulling her and Henry into the center of the room. He didn't look at the elders. He looked at the woman who had held his world together in the dark. "The choice is made," he said. "Now let's see who's brave enough to try and take it back." The thunder that shook the Ju-Mong estate at 2:14 a.m. wasn't a storm. It was the sound of the perimeter gates being vaporized by C4. The alarms didn't chime. They screamed a jagged, rhythmic warning that turned the east wing into a strobe-lit nightmare of crimson emergency lights. Anita was out of bed before the first echoes died, her hand already over Henry's mouth to keep his startled breath silent.
She didn't head for the panic room. She headed for the heavy mahogany desk in the corner of the suite, her fingers flying over a hidden panel in the floorboards. "Stay under the desk, Henry," she whispered, her voice like forged iron. "Count the seconds between the explosions. Don't stop until I tell you." Outside, the night was being torn apart by the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of suppressed rifles. The Silvers had come to collect the debt of insulted pride, bolstered by the elders' betrayal. From her window, Anita saw the silhouettes of men in tactical gear swarming the gardens, a black tide against the white marble of the fountain. Ju-Mong appeared in the doorway, his white shirt unbuttoned, a submachine gun gripped in his tattooed hand. His face was a mask of cold fury, but his eyes softened for a fraction of a second when he saw her. "The main gate is gone," he said, the scent of cordite clinging to him. "They've cut the hard lines and jammed the cellular repeaters. We're dark, Anita. My men are fighting blind." "They didn't cut everything," Anita replied, pulling a sleek, unmarked laptop from the floor cavity. She didn't look up as she cracked it open, the blue light of the screen reflecting in her eyes. "They think they've isolated the estate. They don't realize this house is built on a digital fault line." "Anita, get to the cellar," Ju-Mong commanded, stepping toward her. "I can hold them off, but I can't protect you if you're sitting in front of a window." "You don't understand," she said, her fingers dancing across the keys with a speed that blurred. "I'm not hiding anymore. You told the council I was the fortress. Now watch me pull the drawbridge." She bypassed the estate's local security, diving deep into the hidden truth, the encrypted back doors she had installed years ago while scrubbing the Great Patriarch's digital sins. She didn't just have access to bank accounts, she had the master keys to the city's municipal grid, a silent insurance policy she had cultivated in the shadows. Ju-Mong watched, transfixed, as Anita's screen filled with cascading lines of green code. "What are you doing?" "The Silvas brought an army," Anita hissed, hitting the enter key with finality. "But an army needs logistics. They need traffic lights. They need communications. They need power." 3 miles away, the city's central power hub groaned. On Anita's screen, the map of the metropolitan area flickered once, then turned black. Suddenly, the floodlights illuminating the estate's gardens died. The streetlights for 10 blocks vanished. The rival family's tactical headsets erupted in a burst of high-frequency static, a digital scream that forced the invaders to rip the gear from their ears. The city's drawbridges began to rise, isolating the district, and every automated fire suppression system in the Silva's own headquarters began to flood their server rooms. The estate fell into a terrifying, absolute darkness, lit only by the muzzle flashes of Ju-Mong's loyalists. The invaders were paralyzed, their coordination shattered by a woman sitting in a silk nightgown 3 stories above them. "The grid is down," Anita said, her voice echoing in the sudden silence of the room. "Their reinforcements are trapped on the other side of the river. Their comms are dead. They're fighting in a vacuum now, Ju-Mong. Finish it." Ju-Mong looked at the screen, then at the woman who had just paralyzed a city to protect her son. He realized then that he'd spent years fearing the council, fearing the Silvas, fearing the law, never realizing that the most powerful entity in his world had been the woman he once viewed as a servant. He leaned down, pressing a hard, brief kiss to her forehead. "Stay with the boy," Ju-Mong growled, the adrenaline of a king reclaimed surging through him. "I'll be back with their heads." He vanished into the hall, the sound of his boots retreating as the counter-assault began. Anita didn't close the laptop. She watched the digital pulse of the city, her fingers hovering over the keys like a goddess of the machine. She wasn't just a maid who had returned for a life she lost. She was the gatekeeper of the empire, and tonight she had shown the world that the dragon eyes of the sun were nothing compared to the fire of the mother. The smoke from the night's betrayal still clung to the marble pillars of the estate as the first fingers of a cold gray dawn broke over the horizon. The city was slowly flickering back to life, the grid Anita had shattered humming as it rebooted under her command. In the grand hall, the air was heavy with the scent of ozone and spent shells. Juliana sat on a velvet settee, her red dress torn at the hem, her face a frantic mask of smudged mascara and terror. 2 of Ju-Mong's enforcers stood behind her like stone gargoyles. Across the room, Ju-Mong stood with his back to her, looking out at the scorched gardens where the Silva's ambitions had gone to die. He had a smudge of blood on his cheek, and his white suit was ruined, but he had never looked more like a king. "Ju-Mong, please," Juliana whimpered, her voice cracking. "I was pushed. The council. They said you were losing your way. I did it for us, for the future of the family." Ju-Mong turned slowly. The look in his eyes wasn't anger. It was a profound, chilling indifference. "You didn't do it for the family, Juliana. You did it for a chair you weren't strong enough to sit in." He gestured toward the door, where a black sedan waited with its engine idling, a one-way ticket out of the city. "You have 10 minutes to take what you can carry. If you are ever seen within the city limits again, I won't send an escort. I'll send a cleanup crew." "You're choosing her?" Juliana shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "A maid? A ghost from the kitchen?" "You're choosing the woman who held my empire together while I was too blind to see it." He didn't watch her leave. He didn't listen to her final desperate sobs as the guards escorted her out. His focus was entirely on the stairs. Anita descended slowly, Henry's hand firmly in hers. She had changed into a fresh dress of charcoal silk, a color signaling that she was no longer a shadow, nor a servant. She looked at the room, at the wreckage of the old world, and finally at the man standing in the center of it. Ju-Mong walked toward them, stopping at the base of the stairs. He looked at Henry first, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Go with Mr. Henderson, Henry. He set up the new playground in the West Wing, the safe one." The boy looked at his mother, waiting for her nod. When she gave it, he turned and walked away with the same measured, stoic gait as his father. Left alone in the cavernous hall, Ju-Mong turned back to Anita. The silence between them no longer filled with the ghosts of the past. It was vibrating with the potential of the future. "The council is gone," Ju-Mong said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rasp. "The Silvas are bankrupt. The city is waking up to a world where I am the only power left standing. But I realized something while I was out there in the dark, watching the lights go out." He stepped closer, his tattooed hand reaching out, not to command, but to invite. He offered his palm to her, turned upward, an equalizer's gesture. "I spent my whole life being a master," he whispered, "and I was alone. I don't want a maid, Anita. I don't want a mistress to keep in the East Wing while I play at being a king. I want the woman who can bring a city to its knees from a laptop. I want the Gatekeeper." Anita looked at his hand, then up into the dragon eyes that mirrored her son. "Are you asking for the encryption keys?" "No," he said, a genuine, sharp smile breaking across his face. "I'm asking for the woman who holds them. I want a partner. I want to build a reign that isn't based on the fear of old men, but on the strength of what we've created." He took a final step, his chest nearly brushing hers. "Stay, not because you have to, and not because of the boy. Stay because the empire is yours as much as it is mine. Rule it with me." Anita looked at the hand offered to her. For 7 years she had been a shield, she had been a ghost, she had been a runner. She looked at the ruined ballroom and the man who was finally seeing her, not as a part of his past, but as the architect of his future. She reached out and placed her hand in his. Her grip was firm, her gaze unyielding. "If I stay," Anita said, her voice echoing with the power of the hidden truth she still carried, "we don't just rule the shadows, we change them." Ju-Mong closed his fingers around hers, a silent pact sealed in the light of a new day. "Whatever you want, Anita, the keys are yours."
Hey family, thank you for the constant love and support on this channel. Every like, share, comment, and subscription truly means everything to me and helps this community keep growing. If you're enjoying these stories, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Also, drop your name and where you're watching from in the comments. I'll be giving personal shoutouts and thanking you directly in my next post. I appreciate every single one of you.